Good afternoon, everyone. We'll make a start, and I'm sure people will join shortly, if that's okay. Um, if panelists are okay as well, we make a start, right? Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining the conversation. We have some amazing experts and leaders with us today to unpack some of the important topics that you may have heard already, in the last 2 days around net zero and value chain and etc. as well. But we are going to take a slightly unique angle to that conversation, so I hope you get most out of this conversation. And we want this to be a two-way conversation as well, so it's not just us having conversation on the stage. So we would also welcome your participation. Any questions you may have for the experts sitting here, please feel free to raise your hand as well. Throughout as well, I'm okay with that as long as our panelists are okay. And I have some questions, but if you have any burning question, feel free to raise your hand and come in to join the conversation as well, right? Thank you. Thank you for joining the conversation. Now I have the background info for each of the panelists, but I don't think I would do a good job of introducing them. So what I would like to do is actually ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves very briefly, but most importantly, share with you all, where is their organization's North Star pointing at the moment from net zero point of view. And as you know, we have a department as well here, and please, no questions on the government and the future of government. But other than that, all good, right? Okay, so if we can start with Cantor. So unfortunately, I forgot to mention, Sam has some other appointments, so couldn't join her, but we have Cantor in place of, Sam and representing the department. So if we start with you, Cantor, that would be great.
Thank you. So Sam does send her apologies. Unfortunately, something came up yesterday that she's had to attend. You might have views on that, but I'm sorry. I was just looking at Sam's picture, and you've got the follically challenged replacing this lovely flowing blonde hair. So apologies for that as well. But at the department, what's our North Star? It's driving the lowest cost, low carbon heating for people, and looking at an energy transition that is as cost effective as possible, because we, as consumers, as businesses, basically pay for the energy transition and the cost of energy. So we're very focused on that cost question and focused on delivering the carbon budgets that we're obliged to. So that's what really drives us. And we see heat networks, which are not well-known heating system in the UK, being a big part of that transition. And largely, if you look across Europe, they represent more than 25% of heating in over 13 of the European countries, 2% now. So that's what we're about. We're about driving the lowest cost heating for consumers and for communities and enabling them that choice. Thanks.
Thank you. To the next, please. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Becky, Ritchie, Head of Sustainability at Clarion Housing Group. For those of you that don't know Clarion, we are the UK's largest social landlord with 125,000 properties. 360,000 people call a Clarion property their home. In terms of our North Star, like everyone, we've been focusing on net zero. We've got a 2050 net zero target, but I think the really important part of that target is that it's a just and fair transition to net zero for the residents that live in our homes. And as part of that, we've got an extensive retrofit programme which began in 2020 as part of the demonstrator. We've also been part of the SHDF Wave 1 and Wave 2.1 as well. And we're also developing our Clarion 2050 asset strategy with our medium and long-term decarbonisation and retrofit plans.
Thank you, Becky.
Hi everyone, I'm Lydia Dutton. I'm the Regional Sustainability Lead for CBRE. My role is very much around developing relationships across the UK with our clients to make sure that we're embedding our knowledge and subject matter expertise in sustainability and ESG across the UK. And I think that's it's an area that I'm incredibly passionate about. We're not going to be able to make the transition to net zero in the UK without all of the UK going on that journey, not just a core central London where the rents are prime. the North Star for CBRE as an organisation is around creating the real estate solutions of tomorrow so that business and people thrive. As part of that, we have a net zero target for 2040 globally, with a number of SBTI aligned targets for 2035 as well, which is around kind of 68% reductions in our scope 1 and 2, with a number of other targets relating to kind of the assets that we're operating and managing on behalf of clients. And I think that's one of the things that I want to talk to today, is actually our role and responsibilities in actually engaging with the industry and the role that we have in property services to be able to make that transition happen as well.
Thanks, Lydia. Yeah. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. Great to be here. My name is James Woodhead. I'm Head of Sustainability and ESG for Cushman & Wakefield at an EMEA level. Hopefully everyone is aware of who Cushman & Wakefield are. Very similar to CBRE, we are commercial real estate services companies, providing anything from transactional management and advisory all the way through to property management and supporting global occupiers in integrated facilities management, but also we do project development services. And that's part of the implementation side for us. Regarding sort of like net zero for us as an organisation, we have a target to 2050 across our entire value chain. We are progressing that, but obviously as an advisory company, our footprint's not that deep in terms of its supply chain, where the real sort of value in us working into net zero is actually for the assets that we manage on the behalf of our occupier clients and investor clients. And our focus regarding our own target is to make sure that 70% of the clients on our books, by materiality of footprint, have a target by the end of 2025 to net zero, basically. And that's what we're trying to work with our clients on, just so that we understand that everyone's on the right and same direction. And then regarding sort of just how we sort of apply net zero in the work we do, we're supporting clients all the time around the transition, the cost, and what some of the challenges are in terms of the business case. And the business case is getting harder for some of our occupier clients in identifying where they should be investing and putting funding regarding net zero. But also, like our investor clients, it's what are the drivers, where are they coming from? Are they coming from regulation? Are they coming from occupiers? Or are they coming from actual sort of reporting standards in the EU? So that's a couple of the elements that we're working on.
Thank you, James. And there are lots of diverse points that we can unpack in the next 50 minutes. In fact, I don't think that we have enough time to unpack all of those points. But before I have picked up a few burning questions or points from talking to each of them in the last couple of weeks, as well as what we just heard. But is there anybody here who has real burning question they want to ask before I start my questions? Anybody? Feel free, right? We want this. I know it's lunchtime and third day, but feel free, right? Can we also please close the door there? So we are just hearing people having lots of fun outside, and I'm getting distracted, please, So can we close the door, please? Thank you.
Can I jump in just to follow on really
Yeah, please, yeah.
Because I think absolutely agreeing with kind of the process and the principles and how to take clients on the journey. But one of the things from a recent report delivered by ULI is the Sea Change report, which is just identifying that 90% of investors are now factoring in kind of transition risks and really understanding the importance of what and why they need to be thinking about both net zero, but also kind of the physical climate risks associated with it. And I think it's the responsibilities and the journeys that the responsibilities of the organisations that are getting involved with investors, with occupiers, to help them understand and realise what both those costs are, and then how it can be applied to the buildings that they're owning and operating. So just thought I'd add in that as well.
Thanks, Lydia. Yeah, it was really helpful, and let's unpack that a little bit as we progress the conversation. So no burning questions as of now. So I would then go, in terms of I have picked up some points, and if I can start with you, Cantor, in terms of you mentioned a heating network, you mentioned some of the initiatives that you are putting in place to help citizens drive that energy security and other things, right? I'm really curious to understand. We are at this UK REEF, right, and built environment. How those initiatives and priorities that you're working on currently are going to help built environment sector transition to net zero.
Sure. So thank you. So I think it's quite appropriate that we're in the Rethinking Places Pavilion. I was thinking, because if we think about our energy system at the moment and how we relate to it, we've broadly got used to an energy system where generation happens far away from us in remote places, and we pipe in this gas and we heat our homes individually. And so from our perspective, one of the things that needs to change if we're going to do this cost effectively is to look at communal solutions. We are going to have to look at that, and we're going to have to look at what local can do and what we can deliver in local places. And that's quite a switch for us as a country and communities. And that's part of the question that people face is, where do I do what? And so the first thing we're really focused on is identifying those areas where heat networks will provide the lowest cost, low carbon solution. And that's why we're here. We've got a stand to talk about heat network zoning, which is the policy we're bringing in place to identify those areas. Because we're talking up to a fifth of homes and buildings being supplied by heat networks. So there's 4/5 that's going to do something else. And it's really useful for people to know where they can count on heat networks coming forward. So that's the first thing we're doing. The second thing is communal solutions are difficult. Anyone who's been involved in a community project, I mean, even real estate projects, you have to liaise and deal with so many people, introduce so many risks. So that's the other thing we're trying to do through heat network zoning is bring in this mandation of certain types of buildings to give heat network developers the opportunity to bring these forward at pace and at scale. But alongside that, we need to protect consumers. And so that's the other key element of our platform, is bringing forward the regulation that protects consumers. Because at the moment, heat network customers are not protected. And but Clarion next to me, and they'll have customers that will have faced bad experiences over the years, and that's an experience for many people. So trying to address that, which brings in the final element, is the technical standards that go along with that. It's like, how do we set the standards that people need to follow? But ultimately, this is in the interest of local places, because local places have assets. Local places have things that they can utilize, whether that be energy from waste plants, as much as they can be disliked by communities. They can be real assets to communities if they provide heating. Geothermal sources, another assets. There's a whole mine water sector out there which provides a possible future. And these all help provide heating at lower cost than a standard air source heat pump. And that's what communities can use, but you really need a heat network to utilize them. So those are sort of some of the flavors of what we're focused on as part of this transition. But it does mean that we need to rethink our approach to everyone having their own boiler in their own house and thinking of it more communally.
I really loved a couple of points. I mean, that was really, really great. A couple of points. I think the challenges in terms of net zero, most of us in the room, we're here because we're passionate about net zero and climate, right? We know. And it's we need to come together, right, to address this systematic challenge. And what you just described, community solution, so powerful, right? Bringing communities together to work together to address this challenge and opportunity that we have in front of us, low-cost heating. Lydia, sounds like you want to come in, but I know you also mentioned, Lydia, about, in your introductions also, and Becky, you as well, just transition, right? And I know you have some views around the role that the public sector can play, right? So do you want to build upon what Cantor just said?
I can do. Can I also say,
please.
sorry, I had a really interesting conversation with one of the DESNZ teams yesterday on the heat network stand around the role and the opportunity around sewage works, and that actually that's one area the waste will increase in line with population, whereas there's other heat sources that just won't be, like waste and incineration. We're going to be wanting to reduce those. We're not going to be looking for those to increase, and actually the power and the opportunity from that piece as well, I thought was a really interesting angle that isn't necessarily communicated that widely at the moment. I thought that was really powerful. From a just transition perspective, I think that was very much around the role that public sector can play going forwards in working with kind of industry to actually drive forwards what are the regeneration, the changes that can be made at a local scale and a community scale. And one of the events I've been at earlier this week, there was some statistics around kind of the majority of the United Kingdom really feel like the UK is going up the spout and in a really dire situation. But then when those individuals were asked about what they thought about their local communities, they really felt that there's power in the communities and a real role and responsibility for and belief that their communities were doing okay. And actually then it's that disconnect between kind of what's that communication on kind of a UK-wide piece. But I suppose what I took from that was around the real interest and desire from communities to get involved in how change happens with them, not to them. And I think that's really important. And certainly from a CBRE's perspective and the role that we play with kind of planning and regeneration activities and supporting local governments with accessing, whether it's levelling up funding or whether it's just being able to understand how they can unlock the opportunity within their real estate portfolios to allow for changes and transitions of high streets and local areas. I think that's really powerful and where we're looking to continue to work. But I think you'll have a lot more kind of a hands-on experience as to what that looks like from social housing.
Thanks, Lydia. And it's so encouraging to hear that now we're seeing the desire, you mentioned, desire and, to be part of the change, not just to experience that change is happening to them, right, in communities. So powerful to get to that stage. I know it's slower, but, to get to that stage where we can get communities and businesses, all private sector, public sector, working together is really powerful position to be in. So thank you for sharing that. So if we move the conversation forward, most of us know that, majority of almost maybe more than 80% of the building stock required for 2050 already exist, right? So therefore, I think retrofitting has a key role to play in terms of our ambition for 2050 and net zero, right? And Becky, I know we spoke last week, and from social housing point of view also, you mentioned some numbers, which I forgot, but it was more than 100,000 something, right, properties, and right, huge number of social housing properties. What do you see some of the challenges and opportunities in terms of scaling up our efforts towards, the retrofitting from net zero point of view?
Sure, thank you. So to build on Cantor's point about heat networks, so Clarion's got about 80,000 gas boilers and over 200 shared heating systems to transition to net zero. So although we've started on the retrofit journey, there's still a really long way to go. And we've been trying to sort of pre-plan for some of those heat network zones that are coming. So looking at actually what the opportunities are to connect in to those shared heating systems and where we'll need to provide on-site heating ourselves. In terms of the challenges, finance, I probably won't go into detail because I'm sure everybody knows that finance is a challenge. We've got SHDF, which has been really great at kickstarting our retrofit programme, but we need more financing to go at the scale and pace that we need to meet those targets. Innovative funding and finance is something that we're looking at, but so that's the financing challenge. There's also a challenge around green jobs and skills, which I'm sure everybody here is aware of as well. In Clarion, we've set up a green jobs and skills group, so we can leverage green jobs and skills in our supply chain, but also work with residents to ensure they're able to access training and access some of those employment opportunities. Building on Lydia's point about the just transition, I think almost the most challenging part is working with residents, ensuring they've got agency in the transition, bringing them along on a participative journey as well. So engaging with them up front, bring them on the journey so they can understand what's happening to their home, how they can use the new technologies that are going in, and we need to absolutely be sure that they're not paying any more ultimately on their bills when we're transitioning them to low carbon heating source. But there's a really big opportunity there as well to bring them along on the journey and educate them and help them understand why climate change is important in their neighbourhood. And just to say, we're not only looking at net zero carbon from that perspective, we're looking at like a place-based approach, so looking at other things around green spaces as well, transport and other sustainability areas. The only other thing I was going to mention was collaboration, because that's what the session's about. Collaboration is really important. I'm sure everybody in the room knows that already. It's a key opportunity, particularly in that place-based approach, for lots of organisations to come together with the supply chain, leverage those local opportunities for employment, create some of those green jobs and skills that I just mentioned. And then finally, data. So data about the assets, data before you do the retrofit, data during, and then data afterwards, although there are significant GDPR challenges with getting residents' energy data, so that can be tricky. I think that's everything that I was going to cover.
No, you covered a lot in that, right? And I wish we had a lot more time beyond this 115 to unpack. But I really loved that place-based approach, and I would certainly like to, while we are all here together in the room, unpack that a little bit, in a minute. But if I could come to you, James, on this point about this whole retrofitting, and from the commercial real estate advisory point of view, how do you see that opportunities and challenges from your experience?
Yeah, so being totally upfront, it's we deal mainly in the commercial real estate side, so less close to the sort of struggles within the housing side. But I will say I have a shared heating system, and I hate it with a passion. It costs me far too much a year because it's an old gas boiler, and I wish they would get rid of it, to be quite honest, and I could have my own boiler. But it just needs to be a more sustainable system, and I do understand that the sort of move there. And I've got single glazed windows, which is an absolute pain as well. So I'm in the worst possible case, and I'm a leader in sustainability apparently. So not doing my bit from that point of view, but it's out of my control. So what do we do? So we work with obviously institutional investors and occupiers. What we see, we work with a lot of the high-end office assets, high-end sort of investment in central city locations. And we see there is a clear demand for sustainable real estate in that space, and there is not enough stock out there for what occupiers want and what they're demanding in terms of higher grade assets. So there's still this place in the sort of high-end real estate for logistics, retail, and offices that we see for more sustainable real estate. But our concern primarily sits then within the tailwind of assets in the UK stock and stock in Europe, which doesn't have that same demand profile at all. There's a different occupier base that is not looking at the sustainability of their real estate at all. They just need a place where they can go to work and function as a business, and also live and enjoy. So where we're sort of positioned in terms of like the challenge, I suppose, from our perspective, and I think what's going to be really interesting, we've obviously seen in the UK with the ratcheting up of MEES at the minimum standard, energy efficiency standard, with the F&G as the minimum rating. Obviously, there is still questions about the regulation that's coming through by 2030, and it's not in place at the moment for EPCFB, which clearly is a fundamental issue that we have at the moment, and I'm not sure where that's going to land with the current, the next year with where government sits. Where my fear sits with all of this in terms of challenge is that it's great to have that target. It's great for our institutional investors to have a target of getting all their assets to a rating of a B by 2030. But I think you're going to get a lot of assets stuck between E to C rating in the UK stock, and I think it's going to get jammed there for a long time, because we're going to be able to submit exemptions, we're going to be able to work around the 7-year payback rules and different things like this, and different mechanisms for basically avoiding what we do need to invest in terms of retrofit. And that's me speculating what I expect to see, because we still see it with F&G rated buildings. There's a lot of exemption there. So where do I see some of the opportunities around this? I think, first of all, lenders and banks have a really strong role in pushing this, and they can enable a lot of finance around retrofit, whether that's sort of ratcheting up on sort of the borrowing terms that they provide, mortgage or loan. And they I believe they do have a clear role alongside government in actually providing the residents and people that take loans to provide them the right tools. So that might be an EPC tool that tells a resident, this is how much I can, if you were to invest X amount, this is how much you can improve your savings per year. And by what are the mechanisms on grants and things that you can take at the same time. Those types of things and mechanisms, a lot of banks, I think, can probably do. I think there's a lot of questions around an opportunity for valuation in terms of driving the narrative around the 80% of building stock in the standing portfolio, and just what is the role of, when we look at valuation, can we actually tell what the increase in capital value or yield is? And there's a lot of research at the moment supporting that there's actually more stabilized capital values for real estate with that's more sustainable. But we need bigger samples, we need more data to support this, and so we need to follow the guidance of things like RICS and BSI if they come out with something similar looking at this. But the fundamentals are that we need to look at that. And sort of to move that forward, and again on opportunity, I think occupiers need to ask a lot more of their landlords. And I think that's they have a lot of leverage. Landlords are in a slightly distressed space where they don't want to be losing tenants in the next few years. And we see it a lot about occupiers coming to us and being like, how can we align our real estate to our ESG commitments? And that is a fundamental question that, that can be really answered by collaboration between the landlord and tenant. And I think that's what the landlord needs to be looking at, and understanding these questions are going to be coming up more and more. And that comes down to the wish list of what a sustainable asset is, right? So what does that asset look like, and where does that investment come from? That's an opportunity for both investors and occupiers to work together to move things forward in the real estate that they occupy. And I think investors, just on a sort of last opportunity, and is about creativity. There's a lot of mechanisms out there at the moment coming through, like SFDR and SDR, which obviously means that funds are being launched, which this is personally for me quite interesting. We see more capital going into value add at the moment than core. The value add side is brown to green, and the investment, and that is a massive opportunity that we're going to see a lot of retrofit happening from that side of capital. And in the next few years, we're going to see the actual outcome of that as companies now have to disclose. And so for us, that's a really important aspect. So where does that all sort of sit? I think with the 80% of stock that's out there, if we look at the sort of value chain side of things, there are a lot of fundamental components with those stakeholder groups that all have their role to play. And they can sort of really, if they can understand the dynamics of each one in terms of like impact and finance and incentive, I think there's a lot of progress we can make in the next few years, supported by regulatory compliance, if the government can get themselves in order on that side. That's about it.
Thank you, Jim. First of all, thank you for your
I've gone on a bit there, sorry.
No. It was brilliant, actually. And I'm not a finance background, so most of it I was just like really taking in and say, wow, we have maybe the thinking there, right? We have thinking here. And you highlighted, from value chain point of view, some really, really important point from my perspective. The role, most importantly, the role the tenant and occupier can play, right? And how they can leverage their position. And I know I'm meant to be moderating and asking questions to the panelists only, but just by show of hands, are there any commercial tenant or occupier who engage in this kind of conversation with your landlord, or any experiences? Anybody? Yeah. So would you like to share that? I mean, build upon this point. Do you need mic, sir?
That's right, I'll shout out loud. David Laversha from WSP. 18 months ago, we were looking at coming to the end of a lease for one of our big offices in London. The landlord at the time wasn't too keen on investing in the building, so there was quite heated debates about, well, in that case, we'll be walking. And at the end of the day, we stayed because a deal was done. We've reduced the energy use intensity by about 75%, and we're happy to be back in that building. And what's really interesting about that, as an example, we had to learn from that as a tenant about, as WSP, we've got 700 buildings around the world, about how do we liaise with our landlords to put pressure on to be doing the right thing. But also, from a designer's perspective, is also when we're talking to our clients going forward, there's a real learning opportunity there, in the sense that for that client, they've now got a sitting tenant for another 15 years. And, probably if they wanted to try to add that same level of value, they historically might have looked at dropping that building and rebuilding it. So they've actually got, it's a win-win for everyone, but especially for the climate, because we saved a huge amount of embodied carbon by retrofitting. So I encourage everyone to do the same.
Thank you for being our fifth panelist, and thank you. Right, thank you. But no, so we have some examples in the room already. That's fantastic. That's practical application of what James, you just, Lydia, do you want to build?
And I think it's that piece around landlords taking the initiative to understand what are the implications of that transition early doors, so that when they're going into those conversations with the lease break negotiations or occupiers coming in, that you've got a plan. And I think even having a plan is that start of the journey to be able to engage with the occupiers on what you're looking to do. I think the other side of it is that occupier piece, is to making sure you're asking the right questions at the right time, of the value chain within the business as well, recognising kind of those the hundreds of buildings that you've got, and certainly the clients that we work with, helping them understand the toolkits that they need to be putting in place, that are thinking not only about the building itself, but how does it sit in the wider portfolio and that transition to net zero. And then increasingly kind of this physical climate risk piece as well, and understanding how and what the physical climate transition is going to mean for the assets, and implications on your staff being able to even get to the buildings, let alone kind of the building functioning from a net zero perspective. So it's making sure right questions, right time, from all sides.
So while you have Mike with you,
Yeah.
I'd like to come to you, continue the conversation, right? Thank you. So both you and James, sort of similar profile in terms of businesses, right? I
Yes.
heard in terms of commercial real estate and working with occupiers, investors. I heard, advising, lenders, etc. What are the top three things then that you believe? You both mentioned value chain. You both mentioned, the role that everybody needs to play. What are the top three things then, in your opinion, that can support uniting that value chain in terms of transitioning towards net zero?
I think certainly from an investor perspective, it's understanding your whole portfolio, and then identifying and prioritising which assets you should be focusing on. I think and understanding the capex spend. So that's kind of one, understanding your portfolio and the capex spend. I think the other consideration that perhaps we haven't touched on yet is those assets that, and certainly from a commercial kind of office perspective, what are those assets that just aren't going to work as commercial offices going forwards, or the transition from retail into offices or into residential? Kind of what's that potential for change of use which still enables that viability and transition to net zero as well. And then my final one is just around certainly this is probably from a landlord perspective, thinking about how can you, in that transition space, recognising that certainly the flight to quality argument as well, is how do you make sure that your assets not just meeting the net zero, but also meeting the health and well-being requirements, the active travel, the slightly more the S of the ESG, the social elements of and attributes of a building that are going to make sure that even if you tick the net zero box, you're also making sure that you're addressing the wider elements of occupiers' needs. And
James, yeah.
I'll try and come up with something slightly different. I think number one, in terms of in the top three, number one is about target setting, I think, and actually understanding. So, like I said, at the moment, a lot of our occupiers that we work with, they will use EPCs and certifications as the proxy for a sustainable asset. Fundamentally, what we need to be looking at is obviously energy intensity as the key and primary metric. But to do that, we have to have clarity of both investor and occupiers about what that looks like in the different sectors. And obviously, everything has to be contextualized in terms of the use of the asset. But we do have to have a working principle, working benchmarks that we are confident to support, and also are going to be there for the next few years, so that we can sort of bake that into the narrative when we're looking at transactions and leasing arrangements. Secondly, I think incentivization is something that we don't look at and think about enough, and that's around, we're a property manager, and we work with a lot of our landlords. We have our property management agreements. For years, sustainability has been quite a fluffy generalization in our contracts, and fundamentally, we actually have to look at a position of saying, what's the performance and incentives and KPIs that we should be putting in this? And we have to have that conversation and be like, well, what type of skill sets do you need on these accounts as well? Like, you've got property management FM, but do you need energy managers? They don't come free, and we need to have that. And so we need to have that conversation. investors are moving to a place in which they're more open and amenable to have that, but it's been slow. A lot of focus has been on just data management. And that's on us as well as a property manager. If we look at it, actually, what do we ask of our M&E contractors as well? And how do we put performance KPIs and energy performance contracting in place with them? And I don't mean the typical EPC energy performance contracting. I mean, what's the incentives for them within our contracts? So that for me seems to be a low-hanging fruit that we could really embed and incentivize the value chain from that perspective. I think third is then linked to my first point, which is about data and transparency, about what we're all trying to work towards, and making sure that during transactions we're actually able to qualify and assess a building by its actual performance. And that links into, if you have that, then you can target set and you understand what you're actually going towards. So that's sort of the 3 points that I would focus on, but I'm focusing this all on standing portfolios, transactional, rather than the development side, as that's a sort of separate piece, and then the embodied carbon side is not in that. But yeah.
Oh, thank you. A really, really great 6 points. I was only hoping for 3, but really good. From 3 each of you. Really, really practical steps that the supply chain can take as well, value chain can take. So thank you for sharing that. Before I move on to the collaboration part, because all of you mentioned collaboration, and we saw some fantastic collaboration in the room as well, right? And we had good participation from the audience as well. I'm really curious to understand from you all, and I'd like to come to you, Cantor, first, if that's okay. How can we increase even further collaboration amongst the entire value chain? And how do you see, I know you mentioned, I think most of you mentioned word standards, which was music to my ears as BSI, British standards, right? Yeah. So that was music to my ears, but how do you see standards playing a role in empowering people to adopt that common approach, common language, in terms of increasing the collaboration?
I think one of the things I have been struck by sort of coming into the sector and learning about it is we have some conceptual visions of how the sector should operate, and then what you encounter is the messy world of reality. And I was just listening to your example, a great example of how you've taken action. But if we look at what happens in the heat network sector and think about management agents in buildings, they have very little time, very little resource, and they need quick ways to resolve many problems often. They don't spend a lot of time in them. I've been trying to mentor one for the past year. He hasn't made a single meeting because he's had an emergency to deal with everywhere. So I think for me, standardization is important, not only in technical areas where we talk about it a lot, but across the whole chain, because they save time. I think that's the real big thing. I mean, if everyone has to negotiate with their landlord about every element of the transition, we are not going to make 2050. And that, for me, is the role of standardization at the end of the day. So we're really focused, as we look at zoning, how do we standardize the process by which we award zones? When we're looking at technical standards, how do we standardize the process by which people judge whether a building has been built well? We've been doing some videos on speaking to those people who don't have lots of time, like, how do you procure a good building management service? Because heat networks, 3% of the country, they're not that common. So if you've got a heat network, how do you procure a good building management service for a heat network? You don't have time to go on a long course to do that. So I think that's, for us, some of the challenges. Standardization ultimately helps with speed and reduced effort. And one of the things that we noticed, and I don't know if the CBRE noticed as well, is, I certainly know this is an issue for the social housing, is there are other bigger priorities. Grenfell has really knocked the social housing sector. They haven't been able to really think about other things. And so that's where standardization helps as well, is, how much time do I have, and can I rely on something else to do a lot of the heavy work for me? So that's sort of broadly our view, and we're very, very supportive of it, but it's not magic, and yet it has to be thoughtfully done.
And yesterday I was sitting in a panel audience, in one of the digitization panel in Atkins, and one of the panelists said, standards are not fun, which I can see all of you laughing and nodding now. Yeah, well, it's not fun, right? I mean, getting people alignment to do something is not fun, right? I mean, I got 2 children at home and trying to get them aligned in what way, I just forget it. I mean, I'm just digressing now. But thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And if I can, I know, Becky, you also mentioned, some of the need actually there to have that common approach and consistency. Would love to hear your thoughts in terms of that. How can we increase that collaboration?
Sure. I was just going to mention, I've worked in lots of different parts of the public sector, so local authorities, NHS, and now in housing. And I think bringing consistency to the reporting will really help with that place-based approach and understanding actually the scale of the challenge within a particular area. I think at the moment, different sectors in the public sector report in slightly different ways, so it's hard to have that overall picture and help that transition. We've got the net zero carbon building standard coming, which is good news and should help with that, but there are also other standards out there as well, so yeah.
Thank you, Becky. And Lydia, do you have any thoughts on this collaboration, standardization?
Yeah, I think the work being done by the Better Building Partnership, particularly on the green leases piece, has been really, I mean, a number of us in the industry were waiting for quite a while for that to be delivered. And I think having, again, that example of how it can be delivered repeatedly without having to start reinventing the wheel each time, I think is really powerful. And the Chancery Lane project that feeds into that as well around the green leases, because I think that, again, is that point at which the occupiers and the landlords can have those I say open dialogues between the lawyers, have a dialogue as to what's needed and how they're going to be interacting going forwards on whether it's net zero or kind of wider sustainability aspects as well.
No, thank you, Lydia. James, do you have any thoughts on collaboration and standards?
Yeah. So, I mean, ultimately, standards are fundamental for us delivering consistency, and we need systemically we need consistency in this topic, because a lot of it's quite broad, and if you start talking about sustainability holistically, you start opening up a whole other sort of conversation of well-being, employees, everything, and community, and what we need to start off is back to the basic principle of what are we trying to achieve, and we need a standard which will help us with that. So, and I think the organisations out there like BBP and people like that, and BSR are doing an incredible work to try and standardise as much as possible. We just have to get people actually adopting those standards as much as possible, so that there is some consistency when we talk to our clients, so that when we start talking about a particular topic, they already know what to expect from the different types of advisors they're going to consult with. Because at the moment, our scope of works that we work with our clients on sustainability can be broad and varied, unless it's been in the market for a number of years and it's highly commoditized and everyone knows what they're buying. But otherwise, the conversation is quite nuanced, and it holds things up, and then people don't know what they're getting. I think that's where the standards can really help in terms of articulate the service that clients are going to receive in terms of delivering sustainability across their real estate.
Thank you. And you made a really good point, because most of the time people think, oh, we got standard, so what? I mean, standards are only as good as people using them. If there is no adoption, then we're not going to move the needle, right? And we all need to come together to actually adopt that good practice, whatever that good practice is. And yesterday, actually, I bumped into an old friend of mine, and she's heading up sustainability into an organization, and she said, we were having chat about sustainability, and she said something that was quite profound to me, and she said, Rahul, I'm so fatigued by standards now, it makes sense, resonates with you. There are so many standards. Like you mentioned, sustainability is so wide. I mean, there are 200 plus standards minimum, if not 1,000, right? I mean, if you start unpacking all the elements of sustainability. And she said, oh, Rahul, is there any one standard that I should look at, and that's it, and then start with that? And my answer to that, and that was my answer, right? I'm not saying you should, but my answer to that was, if you're in build sector, the only one standard I would recommend would be PAS 2080. Go and look at it. And it's freely available. You don't have to pay. Just go and look at it. It's a really brilliantly written framework in terms of how do you manage carbon. It's not about neutrality, it's about managing, right? So I really agree, and also that the work that BBP and the UK net zero building standards, these are the standards that it's only as good as us using them, right? So yeah, please, use them. But really good.
I
I'd
think
love to use.
just a point on that. As long as it's fine having multiple standards,
Yeah.
but I think the confusing thing is where there's multiple goals set in place.
Yeah.
Like there's many different routes to achieve the same target, and if you've got 20 different targets, that's when it really fucks things up because you don't know what you're trying to aim for, basically. So
Yeah.
the route to getting to that place is fine, but as long as there's not lots of different variations on the definition of net zero and things
Yeah.
like that, and we actually have a sort of, and the minimum energy efficiency standards and how we apply those, that's what we need consensus and everything on. The standard of how you get there can be your own story of
Yeah,
how you
correct.
do that. Obviously, if we're all doing the same thing, then great, but it's organisationally dependent on how you're set up and what your objectives are.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And net zero, there is ISO net zero guidelines as well. If you want to have that consistent language and definition and framework also, what is net zero? That is another one that I would highly recommend. But if I can use your tagline, standards increase speed. Did you say speed and reduce efforts, right? That's a brilliant tagline. If anything, I would take that away from this conversation. Thank you. So yeah, I think we are coming, we got 15 minutes left, and I don't want to be selfish and keep asking the question that I have, hoping that you learn from it. I'd like to open it up to the floor as well, and let's have that interactivity. So yeah, let's go with there first.
Pride myself on having a loud, boomy voice, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts on to what extent lease events are causing latency in decision making, and how you think as an industry we could sort of promote having mid-term discussions between landlord and tenant.
Shall I go? Yeah, so are you talking about trying to enable action before a lease event comes up? Because otherwise we're just waiting for the next 20 years for a lease event.
That's right, and I guess your sort of your general current thoughts on the position of whether people are waiting or whether you think that people are being proactive even in the absence of regulation.
Yeah, this is a really interesting one. I think this is, again, comes down into the implementation of like the minimum energy efficiency standards in the next few years. Again, how leases are going to interact with that and where occupiers are willing to enable change within their space. For us, a lot of our occupiers that don't have a lease event coming up, I'll put it this way, they're looking at the lease events which are happening in the next 5 years so they can learn from those negotiations to leverage what they can. But they're in a position to leverage at this point with their landlords. And that then enables action and change. The striking issue does happen is when, like you said, the lease event is really far out. And it comes down to who your landlord is. And that's what a bit of an issue at the moment with some of the occupiers we talk to. They just have quite shit landlords who don't have an objective and target in place and aren't willing to collaborate and work with them. And it doesn't make it great for the occupiers when they're just like, that's not going to help us meet our goals. They're the difficult landlords, but there are landlords that we work with every day which are basically very willing to have the conversation of what those adaptations and changes might look like. We're supporting clients all the time do the transition and cost to net zero, and their lease events aren't going to happen in the next 5 years. They're going to happen in the next 15 years. So landlords are looking at this now. It just means a bit of outreach from tenants and landlords outreaching to their tenants to say, well, what do you want to see from your space in the next 10 years? Because we want you to sign that lease again in 10 years' time. And so they should start thinking about what the tenant, and landlords, we're discussing it all the time, is like, what's the tenant at 2030? What's the tenant at 2040? And you can only start considering that if you're taking action now before a change happens. But obviously, for the majority, there's still a lot of issues and challenges.
And I think, again, it comes back to that having a plan. What is your route to net zero or reach net zero for that building, so that then you've got something to work with the occupiers on? Because actually, without having an understanding of what's needed or what can be done, it starts off in the conversation starts with the unknown, so many unknowns that it's hard to like even kick it off. So I think where we're working with landlords is to understand, well, what and how do lease events influence what they could and should be doing on their assets, to be able to then inform kind of those conversations, that they can also be quite proactive in having those conversations early doors. But I think, again, just plan and have an understanding.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And it was, I wish there was one each. There's a lot that landlords can be doing with in the in-between time, though. And I think this comes down to what we don't see enough of is trying to optimize the building as it is, and actually saying, right, the equipment's not going anywhere for the next 10 years because it's not come up to end of life, or there's a natural cycle to some of these things when we talk about circularity, reuse, and just not waste. There's a lot of optimization that needs to happen, and landlords should be looking at that, and as part of the energy management strategy and part of the plan that Lydia was talking about, so that we can actually start to make some impact now. And I think that's a key fundamental.
So sort of strategic asset management and property managers sort of being the people who could lead that charge in sort of getting that conversation going before the lease events.
Yeah, 100%.
Brilliant, thanks.
Thank you. Anybody? Yeah.
Thank you. Rob Molyneux, Lucy and Delta Simons. A question for Becky. You said at the start you had a 2050 property strategy, and I think most of the conversation was around decarbonisation. Just interested to how much climate resilience is built into that property strategy yet, or if that's the start of that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So we've been reporting into TCFD, so we've done a high-level climate risk mapping of all of our 125,000 assets, and actually the next stage for us now is like looking at what the practical measures are. I think we're going to start with overheating, because obviously that's going to be across the board, basically. So looking at how we can weave that into our retrofit program, so we're not doing one thing and then going back later and doing something different. I think that was the answer. I thought of something else, but I think it's gone.
We can come back later.
Okay.
On that one. There are two questions here first, and and then we'll. Yep.
Thank you once again, panelists, and thank you being very honest, James, about your own landlord. With all due respect to landlords, if I may, I think it's really difficult. Say, for instance, somebody's got a portfolio of 3 or 4 or 5 million pounds, and if he then has to, and you mentioned, Cantor, about the capacity and the capability and the skill side of the property managers, for them to then employ a technical consultant to first go through the whole process of project development, they would have spent 200,000-300,000 pounds on that side, or quite a lot of money. And to be fair, that is literally a loss, because you haven't even looked at the commercial contract or the financial modeling by that time. So my pushback a little bit is, and it will be really interesting to hear the thoughts, if suppose the banks are reducing the interest rate, which is soaring high at the minute, from 7 to 5% or 4%, which was mentioned in another panel, if you are investing into low carbon technologies, then that can be invested into the development of moving from gas to low heat pump or whatever it is. And again, from Clarion's perspective, if you've got a big, I think you mentioned 80,000 and 200,000, so big numbers there. Octopus mentions that they give free heat pumps to developers. But in a heat network, you get much bigger heat pump at a much bigger scale, so flexibility, aggregation can be done at a higher scale. And I know Flex-to-City does for Gateshead, and they get value. Are we looking at those models, working with DNOs? And I know it's hard, but at that level, because Clarion is a big housing group, but working with DNOs, the energy suppliers, to bring down that finance down from that perspective. So in the end user will not have to pay extra. But it needs to be looked at holistically, the whole system. Sorry for a long question.
I'm here for the first part. When I talk about sort of investor clients, I think, I said it earlier on, is you've got this high-end office assets where there is the business case, and it comes through quite clear for some of this transition, and they can pay for the technical aspects to look at what the cost of transition is and put that plan in place. That goes to my point of that fear of the sort of tail end of assets and landlords, where it is fundamentally a much harder conversation, because either the upskilling side or the business case just simply isn't there to, and their margins are already really low and strapped, where actually the cost to look into the technical work is going to cost several thousand before even investing in the actual upgrades themselves. And I think the more proof points that the industry can put out there in terms of retrofit and supporting the business case and the creativity out there with banks in terms of incentivization schemes and those things that the industry can share and learn from for the sort of private landlords that are, that do need support in this transition, that sort of literature and education piece is out there and sort of it's very readily available for them to take advantage of from the learnings of some of the sort of more leading that have the deeper pockets that they can actually put into this. And that would be probably what I would say to that. But yeah, when I say shit landlords, I don't mean shit landlords in the sense that everyone's bad. It's principally in that it's where they're not open to that conversation about, having a conversation to improve an asset during a lease event, and it all starts with collaboration, right? And so all we want to say is if there's a bit of openness between some of those landlords with the tenants, that's a great starting point. So yeah, I'll let Becky have the rest.
Thanks, James. So to answer your question in terms of what we're looking at, I mentioned place-based approach. I've mentioned the heat network evaluation that we're doing. So we're really looking at actually what are the solutions for us, I think, across that large property portfolio. So we're sort of going through that planning phase at the moment. So where will we need to take action? Where should we be engaging with the DNO? Where should we be engaging with the heat network zone operator once that comes into force? So I think we're sort of at that mapping stage, as well as obviously running the retrofit program that I mentioned through SHDF. So we're sort of two-pronged approach at the moment. And also, to pick up on your point, James, looking at actually like the efficiency of the things that we're going to be keeping for a while. So those heat networks that we're not necessarily going to be transitioning immediately, actually, what is the optimization plan for those? How can we ensure that residents are paying the lowest costs possible?
Thank you. So we have one question here and one question at the back. 5 minutes left, right? Correct? Yeah. Yep.
I think this is a question for you mainly, Becky. Just something kind of Cantor mentioned in terms of, and mirrored conversation I'd had with social landlords as well. They've got other things to think about other than heat networks at the moment. I was just wondering how you view heat networks kind of at Clarion, and also how you think about communicating the benefits and also complexity and the change to heat networks to your customers.
Yes, it's challenging. I think it's a challenging portfolio, the existing portfolio that we've got, because we've got those 200. Obviously, they're all slightly different. So management perspective, it's quite tricky. And we've got heat networks that we own and operate, and then those that are run through an ESCO, so where we've got less control and where we're getting contacted by residents, but we can't necessarily make the changes. So I think in terms of the transition, like I was saying before, it's about bringing residents along on the journey. So we're going to need to communicate with them up front. I think there's also a challenge there with mixed tenure. So if we're looking at blocks, we've got some social tenants, we've got leaseholders in there. We can't it's really challenging because we can't be charging them for the transition but we can't do it without them. So I think there's a piece there around funding, I think, and I think with SHDF Wave 3, which the guidance has just come out, that there's an opportunity to bring some leaseholders on the journey, but I think there's a lot of complexity around the funding, and that could do with being streamlined to enable us to sort of take that more place-based approach. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you. And there was one question at the back.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Ellie I lead on Net Zero at Birmingham City Council. So I have both the exciting opportunity but also major challenge of how we enable heat networks and what we do with areas where heat networks are not suitable. But I guess my question, and in part, Becky, you've alluded to this already, is from an asset management perspective, there does seem to be, and I think maybe this is to be challenged by those who manage assets and assets on behalf of others, a kind of tendency to think about just your own estate, not necessarily the location in which it's based and the likely transition pathway for heat, etc., within that place. And I just wondered whether, A, you're kind of either asking on behalf of your clients or your clients are asking, well, what's happening in the locality? What is going to be the transition pathway within which we need to assess? And related to that, what you would find helpful from local government, like myself, to actually give clarity to what that direction of travel looks like, because I think that's the role I think we've got, but I'd be really interested on your reflections on that.
Brilliant question.
It's a really good question. Yes is the short answer. The longer answer is, I think that kind of wider place-based thinking of the assets that organisations are within is coming through when they're starting to think about the S in the ESG, when they're actually the positioning of how their asset is responding and engaging with the wider community. And obviously that doesn't just relate to kind of community volunteering, it relates to how are you participating in the environmental journey of that space. So I think increasingly yes, but it's not as fast paced as it could and it should be. The one thing I'd add just with Birmingham, I'm based in Birmingham, and so I sit currently on the Colmore bid, where we're looking at how can we actually be supporting those organisations that are based within the central business district on engaging with their landlords, engaging with the wider kind of community to address impacts and understand what's happening in the wider piece. So I think it's increasingly happening on those, both the local level, where occupiers and kind of the local landlords are thinking about what is that transition, but then certainly from an institutional perspective, when they're starting that kind of understanding a portfolio scale, identifying the opportunities and the risks associated with the local environments of their assets. So it's coming, just not quite yet at the pace, but I think you've probably got
all I was going to say was the information that you can provide on is the transparency about what the local plans are, because like I said, we support clients with these costings to transition plans, but often it's looked at in silo at asset by asset basis, and it's not thinking to your point of like how does it sit within the local built environment, and what are some of the schemes out there that they should be plugging themselves into, literally for heat networks, for instance. But that's because there's not a lot out there at the moment. It's coming, which is, and I suppose it's, that's a lot of outreach you've got to do to make sure that they are evaluating financially what it means structurally for their buildings in terms of infrastructure and everything to take it into account. I think there's going to be a lot of engagement that has to happen for this to be successful, and a lot of conversations.
Thank you. That was a brilliant question, by the way. Thank you. I think we are almost done. Yeah, so we're running out of time now. Thank you so much for your active participation. Thank you, sir, for being part of the panel discussion with us. And thank you, everybody, for active participation. And thanks to the panelists as well, sharing their knowledge. Please, a big round of applause for the panelists. Thank you.